Good afternoon. Let's start with the questions. Question: How should one relate to the theory of Professor Savelyev? Simply, thoughtfully. We must never forget that man is a part of the biosphere. But to reduce everything to human biology is also not appropriate. Therefore, one must be thoughtful, meaningfully comprehending the facts that he gives, and supplementing what he is silent about with other facts in such a way that a holistic picture takes shape, in which there is a place for both biological and socio-cultural components. Next question. I would like to formulate a question on the theme of lies. If the supersystem does not work towards development, then is the lie the reason for the pushing out of the element by the environment? I want to decide for myself the question of how much, contrary to the established rules of behavior, I have to be a crystally clear transmitter according to the principle, what I see, so I sing. Or nevertheless you need to look for a middle ground, in your family and among friends. Everything is honest and without half measures, and at work you have to act as the director wants, as it's accepted in the team, for the sake of promotion. And I will supplement my question with a proposal. I believe that all the laws of countries and organizations are written in such a way that the elite of the leadership that gets benefits remains on the side of the truth, and only managers who bend before them should lie. I suppose that in this way the leadership cuts itself off from the need to lie, and the subsequent pushing out from the environment, and the executive managers take on the whole blow of the redistribution of the supersystem for disrupting the transmission of information. If you can explain or direct me to a place where you can read about it or listen to it in your interviews, I will be more than grateful to you. Well, what can I say about lies? Indeed, by and large, there is no lie for salvation, because a lie, remaining in the system, remaining in the noosphere, sooner or later becomes the basis or prerequisite for developing an inherently wrong governorial decision. Another thing is that people are very often weak to tell the truth, in all cases without exception. In addition, when we say something, we usually don't think about the mood in which we say something. This also applies to those situations when we are faced with a choice, tell a lie or tell the truth. So if you create the right mood, then you can tell the truth, and nothing that you regard as negative will come. It is another matter if your task is to please your superiors, but this task is incompatible with absolute unconditional truthfulness in all circumstances. Simply, in this case, you must admit that you are simply weak to tell the truth in all cases of life. If we turn to the Quran, then there is the following phrase: Shall I inform you upon whom the devils descend? They descend on every sinful, false one. So, to become possessed, in principle, it is sufficient to lie once. How long the impact of a once pronounced lie will last is an open question. because it is determined by the concretics of what they lied about, in what circumstances they lied, what consequences the lie had at the level of personal relationships, and what consequences the lie has at the level of the noosphere. Because, after all, it is necessary to understand that the noosphere is not an invention of Teilhard de Chardin and V.I. Vernadsky. This is a real field structure that carries reason of the planet, and in it there is a human segment of the noosphere for which, in one way or the other, we all and every one of us are responsible. Another thing is that many of us believe that the collective psyche of the noosphere does not exist, and therefore one can behave the way one wants or the way one can. But lying, in all cases, this is bad. Question. In the cycle of lectures on life on the channel Cognitive TV, you mentioned that once the puppeteers of humanity were curtailed in the development of the right hemispheres in some way. I am curious about the source of this opinion. Or did the collective of authors make this opinion independently, on the basis of the fact that the overwhelming majority of people are one-handed, right-handed, and very rarely left-handed, but never ambidextrous? You see, there is a phrase that is present in many textbooks on biology, human anatomy, psychology, that man has a more developed left hemisphere of the brain, which is responsible for abstract thinking, for articulate speech, and there are other functions. But if we accept this phrase as valid, then another answer is possible. That the left hemisphere is what it is, and the right hemisphere is suppressed. And if we talk about the reasons why an attempt was made, a quite successful one, to suppress the activity of the right hemisphere, then they are simple. Because if man lives without being able to think in images, if his imagination is suppressed and thinking is only lexical in character, then he is in many ways analogous to a computer, which is governed by programming languages of one or the other level. But the connections of identifiers, elements of other algorithms, with reality, in this case they are determined not by a computer, but by an external operator, or a programmer, or a user of the program. And if in a person thinking in images is suppressed, then he perceives words without consideration, and then there begins shameless manipulation, in relation to which he is defenseless. Well, just recall the official fable that Breivik, alone, on the island of Utoya, shot about 70 people. And then find this very Utoya on the internet. Look, there are pictures showing Breivik's route. See what he is armed with, and try to make a cartoon in your head, how he alone could shoot 70 people. And you get a very absurd cartoon, that these 70 people had to line up and wait for him to shoot them all one by one. But if a person does not comprehend, then the question of the cartoon simply does not arise, and he easily believes that Breivik alone shot 70 people. Therefore, the question of the suppression of the right hemisphere is really purpose consonant in a slave-owning culture. The suppression of the right hemisphere solves many of the problems connected with slave owners, that the slave must be dependent on the slave owner. And one of the factors of dependence is the establishment of interconnections between lexicon and what really happens in life. The second question, also connected with the functions of the right hemisphere, is our imagination. Because if we dream of something, then we create a vision of the future. The next question is how to implement this vision of the future through the processes of matrix egregorial governance. But if you are not able to envision the future, then, alternatively, that future will be created that someone is able to envision. And if this is not the most Dobrius representative of the species Homo sapiens, or not at all a representative of the species Homo sapiens, but also not mightily Dobrius, then the future will not be very good, to put it mildly. And only one thing can be opposed to this: the development of one's own process image thinking, the development of one's own imagination, and then acting on the basis of all of this. Because if we talk about the creativity of people in all spheres, then everything starts with imagination. If your imagination is empty, then the act of creation is impossible. Question: is it true that with the majority, the atlas, the cranial vertebra, is blocked and needs to be corrected? For the majority, not only is the atlas blocked, again, it depends on what to understand by the term atlas. Question: is it necessary to keep the placenta with the baby for some time after childbirth? I don't know. Question: in the works of the internal predictor of the USSR, Dead Water, and From Corporativeness Under the Veil of Ideas to Sobornist in the Kingdom of God on Earth, and in some other works, the authors give a univocal evaluation of such a historically established phenomenon in society as astrology. Briefly, this evaluation consists in the following words: the subject domain of astrology as a science is the objective phenomena of life. Almost verbatim. An accurate and more complete quote you can find in the mentioned works, from which it follows that the collective of authors univocally attributes the historically taken shape astrology to the concept of science. No, it is not like this, that the historically taken shape astrology is attributed to the concept of science by the collective of authors. But if you look at life, then life is oscillatory processes, includingly, it is oscillatory processes connected with the movement of the planet in its orbit and the movement of the sun in the galaxy, with the peculiarities of the rotation of the sun, with the peculiarities of the rotation of the planets, satellites, and everything else. These oscillatory processes form a kind of event and energy background in which we live. And to say that this does not affect our life in any way, well, to put it mildly, it would be wrong. It does affect, that is, there is a subject domain for study. In some cases, it is possible to ignore this subject domain, but in order to ignore, you anyway need some potential and the ability to use it. Because not a single navigator, after a storm warning, will go out of the port gates. especially if we are talking not about the era of supertankers, but about the era of the sailing fleet, when ships were relatively small, but nevertheless had to sail in storms. So this is the case with astrology. Another thing is that astrology, along with this, has become a technology for manipulating large masses of people.
Астрология наряду с этим стала и технологией манипулирования большими массами людей.
Because if people themselves do not feel the rhythms of the universe, the rhythms of nature itself, but believe in astrology as such, they easily become objects of manipulation. It is enough to publish astrological horoscopes in the newspaper or on television, into which psychologists upload certain recommendations. And, accordingly, some part of society, having familiarized themselves with the horoscopes, will act in accordance with them. Well, another part of society will be involved in these same processes through mechanisms of autosynchronization, without thinking about what is really happening and what relation astrological horoscopes, which they have not even read, have towards their lives. Therefore, the question of astrology as a science, a potentially possible science, and astrology as one of the political technologies, in some way related to science, these are two different questions that need to be differentiated and one should not so much look at horoscopes as much as, after all, realizing that there is a rhythmics of the universe. One must try to feel it independently and behave in accordance with it. Question. In what concretely do you, Mikhail Viktorovich, and the collective of authors see the methodology of this science, which should connect objective phenomena of life with the concept terminological apparatus of astrology and the models built on its basis? Well, I in fact answered this question, and the members of the collective of authors have never set themselves the task of developing astrology as a science. But ignoring the rhythmics of the universe is also stupid. Another question. In Fundamentals of Sociology in Volume 5 and in the Conception of Social Safety in general, it is said about nature-like technologies to which it's necessary to transition so that there is no collapse of the world, and M.V. Kovalchuk began to talk about this more and more often. How can one understand this? Did they take it from there? Or did this also become the vector of objectives of the global predictor? And M.V. Kovalchuk puts it into practice. Please comment. Well, first of all, the global predictor has been concerned about the prospects of a global ecological crisis since the beginning of the 19th, if not from the end of the 18th century. To prevent and eradicate it, the Marxist project was launched, which was supposed to put an end to the race of rampant consumption for the sake of consumption and pleasure. But it did not take place. Marxism could not solve this task, and nevertheless the task remains, and in some way it must be solved. Therefore, since there are many people, many understand this problem. The intellect, both collective and individual intellects, when faced with the same problems, work out a solution, if not identical, then in many respects close. So one should not be surprised that someone speaks about the need for transition towards nature-like technologies, without having the slightest idea of the conception of social safety, or even being its opponent. You can't get away from it, the circumstances dictate this, and the circumstances dictate the solution of problems. The main thing is only to be more or less responsive to them. Question. I wish you good health. The so-called blessed fire, which supposedly descends from heaven, is this fake? Why not install CCTV cameras? That is there no miracle? I don't know, this question has never interested me. Question. Please give a rough or exhaustive example of governance towards the audience of students as a supersystem. Materials, work, joint practice, minuses, etc. In principle, I cope with this. This lecture gave me something else, but I would like to better understand the process. To reduce the pressure on the development of the technological process, in order to better master the theory of governance towards supersystems and the practice of the lecturer. I think it would be useful for everyone to know, including students. You see, the audience, including the student audience, it is not homogeneous. And many who come to lectures, it would be better if they didn't come, because all the same, they are idle at lectures. They perceive classes in their university as a kind of show, and if the lectures are not interesting for them, then they will find something to do. And to engage in arousing the curiosity of students so that in 5 minutes they will lose the thread of the story, and to attract their interest in you, and to provide material for the curriculum. These are different things. I adhere to the opinion that a student in a lecture should work the way he works in any other class. If he doesn't want to work, let him leave the lecture. Another thing is that as a result of all the reforms of the system of education, teachers in higher educational institutions are placed in such conditions that they are not able to give bad marks. Because if this is done, then a certain number of idle students will be expelled, and after that the staff reduction will begin. Moreover, if you look at the officials of the Ministry of Education and Science, then they, for the most part, as well as their politics, are characterized by the well-known phrase of S.V. Lavrov.
في المعارضة السورية وكما تعلمون أجرينا مرتين ما يسمى بمنتدى موسكو في فبراير وأبريل الماضي ولكننا نواصل.
Officials do not understand that if you want to have a certain higher educational institution, the institution must have scientific schools. Scientific schools are organizationally formed as departments of institutions. And in order for the scientific school to reproduce itself, in it, people of different generations must work, from those who have just graduated from the institution to people who have worked, maybe in this institution, maybe in the national economy, the armed forces, special services, and after that, summarizing some experience from their work, they come to the institutions in order to teach. According to this condition, which ensures the life consistency of the scientific school, and the life consistency of the higher educational institution as a set of scientific schools, it turns out that regardless of how many people you want to train, 10 or 1,000, nonetheless, the nomenclature of scientific schools for training specialists in some one specialty must be determined. And in order for scientific schools to reproduce themselves and develop, the number of institution staff cannot be lower than a certain minimum, conditioned not by the number of students, but by the thematics of training specialists by this institution, and by the list of those scientific schools that should provide this or that knowledge, in order that in the end you have a specialist. If idiots from the Ministry of Education and Science pursue a policy that the number of teaching staff in an institution is proportional to the number of students, then the result is insanity. Because there arise departments of the type Department of Applied Mechanics, Engineering Graphics and Physics. They should what? Draw up the Higgs boson in 3 projections with many cuts, and at the same time draw diagrams of the distribution of internal stresses. But nevertheless, this is a real fact. Departments with such idiotic names in post-Soviet Russia exist in many institutions, and you can't get away from it. The officials, for the most part, are bureaucrats, that is, left-brained guys who don't comprehend anything and don't imagine anything, steering the country. Well, about the quality of such steering, the quality of his life, each person can feel through in himself. Next question. The metrology of love is important for entering into the process of governance upon achievement of love. Non-measurable processes cannot be governed consciously. However, in one of your lectures to the question about the formal way of describing the phenomenon of love, you answered that a formal description of love is impossible, because love is always an unrepeatable process. Such a substantiation of the indescribability of love cannot be considered sufficient, since there are many processes in the world that are also unrepeatable, but, however, are described in one way or the other, at least with generalized categories. The most striking example is processes of governance and self-governance. Even if they are from the same sphere, for example, governance towards only submarines, they are always unique. However, this does not prevent us from singling out generalized categories that describe the process of governance. This, in fact, is done with the sufficiently general theory of governance. The same can be done with the processes of love and her manifestation. I don't want to engage in advertising, but it's important to provide supporting information. To confirm this, see the lectures on metrology of love from the technical organization Zenit, where one of the variants for such a singling out of the sufficiently general categories of love is presented. vk.com/tozenit,
где представлен один из вариантов такого выделения достаточно общих категорий любви.
Well, if you think that love can be metrologically consistently described in certain categories, well, try it. By strength of the concretics of her manifestations, I find it difficult to give such a description. But the concretics of the descriptions of these or those processes, yes, it really can be metrologically consistent. Only by strength of the unrepeatability of the recipes of past love, they are unlikely to be useful for future love. Question. Mikhail Velichko, please help me understand the concept of supersystem. In the definition, everything seems to be simple and clear. A supersystem is a plurality of elements, at least partially functionally analogous to each other in a certain sense, and therefore at least partially interchangeable. When I try to figure out with examples whether it is a supersystem or not, questions arise. The family is not a supersystem because inside it, parents cannot replace children, and children cannot replace parents. On the other hand, the family is a supersystem since from the outside, other adults can replace the parents, other children can replace the children. In other words, the question arises of interchangeability. Is this interchangeability possible between elements only within the supersystem? Or is the interchangeability of elements outside the supersystem also included in this definition? You see, when we talk about supersystems and the interchangeability of elements, then in the defaults remain some functions. The determination of these functions gives us either the definition, it is a supersystem characterized by this and that. If we are not interested in these functions, then the same plurality of elements, in relation to other functions that are of interest to us, it may not be a supersystem. This is concretics. But the set of functions that are of interest to us, we determine ourselves. In addition, as I already said, the entire creation is internested, mutually nested supersystems. That is, penetrating into each other, possessing a virtual structure. This is an objective reality, it is multifaceted, but when it comes to us and usage of the apparatus of the theory of supersystems, then our subjectivism itself determines which of this multifacetedness to choose. And as a result of this, either we are dealing with a supersystem, or we are dealing with some other objects that are not a supersystem in this concrete task. Question. Is it true that the school is a supersystem, although younger students cannot replace older ones, but older school students can replace younger ones? Yes, the school can be viewed as a supersystem. Moreover, not only that younger school children cannot replace older ones, and older school children can replace younger ones, if the school is created correctly, then, in principle, all children in it are teachers to each other, and the one we are used to calling a teacher, he in fact is a coordinator of the self-learning process, a mentor. But we live in conditions when our school is incorrect. Our school is incorrect in terms of educational technologies, co-education of boys and girls, despite the fact that the psyche of boys and girls is different, despite the fact that the dynamics of the development of the organisms of boys and girls are also different. In addition to this, immobility in the classroom and hypodynamia, as a way of life typical for the majority of school children, do not allow them to master the curriculum, even if the curriculum carried the content that is really necessary for life, but not the nonsense that now school textbooks are loaded with. Question. Is it true that a person is an ossified supersystem since he disappears after the body has exhausted its biological resources? Well, a person can also be considered as a supersystem. After all, there is an abundance of cells, certain functions that cells carry. Yes, he can be viewed as a supersystem. But again, it depends on the tasks. Question. Supersystems with a renewable element base. You gave an example of a railroad. Let us recall that all elements of the supersystem have memory, they can receive information into memory, and give out information from memory. As I understand it, this characteristic refers to man and automatics, which have corresponding capabilities. Yes, it is really so. The railway does not function if there is no personnel or if there is no corresponding automatics and software, program support. But into wagons, rails, sleepers, memory is not embedded. Well, connected with wagons, rails, and sleepers is, after all, the memory of people, who, in relation to wagons, ensure their loading and transportation from one certain point to another point. Rails, sleepers, also need to be changed. This is also connected with the memory of people who, together with the material objects of the railway, really form a supersystem. Yes, not all elements are completely interchangeable, but nonetheless, 2 or 3 subclasses arise. Locomotives, wagons. Wagons in their turn are divided into subclasses depending on what types of cargo they can transport. But as a whole, the railway, together with the service personnel, is after all a supersystem. Question. Oleg Gadetsky has a private higher school of practical psychology, where the director is Alexei Anatolievich Babayans. Can you say whether their world understanding and world view are adequate? Is their teaching of a destroying character? You see, if you are personally interested in their activities, then you must decide for yourself what they are. If you develop your cognitive creative culture, then you can, on the whole, quite correctly characterize this system. Find something really tenable in it, if it is present there, and something that is not very good or is very bad, if you find it there. What has a negative impact on the development of the personality of the organism? But again, you see, these are your interests, and I am not an oracle. Question. Can you tell me how to distinguish the encompassing analogues of the elements of the supersystem from the basic elements of the plurality of the supersystem? Encompassing analogues can perform some functions that cannot be performed by the basic elements of the supersystem, as well as the processes of structureless governance that penetrate into the processes of the supersystem from the outside. You see, structureless governance is always the distribution of some informational algorithmic module in a supersystem to which the supersystem and its elements react in a predictable for you way. Another question is, where is the source? Where does the information come from? Inside the supersystem itself, or outside of its boundaries. But, nonetheless, the information enters into the supersystem, and in it there arises the process of structureless governance. Question. I would like to hear an answer on a concrete example. Well, now there are screams about the fact that Russia has poisoned the Skripals. The source of information is situated outside the boundaries of Russia, but it exerts an impact on the supersystem Russia society. Someone believes that the really villain FSB is dreaming up ways to kill traitors and thoroughly takes them out, without pondering on the fact that the proposed method, to put it mildly, is not very effective, and, moreover, poses a certain danger to the executioners of this act. But these are already, you see, problems of those who believe. Again a question. You can't lie under any circumstances. There is no such thing as a lie for salvation. But what if you are telling the truth and they hurt you? They laugh, feel sorry for you, try to teach you a lesson, start giving unnecessary advice, trample with dirty boots on your soul. In order to prevent all this from happening, the truth must be told in a certain mood. But if all this is the case, then somewhere there is a manifestation of a sense of one's own significance. That is, some elements of self-satisfaction. Therefore, one must defend against such things with the right mood. And if there is the right mood, and there is no egoism in the style of I am a great teacher, a great denouncer, and so on and so forth, then all objections on the theme of what you said, they will not reach you, they will not hurt you. Well, as far as dirty boots on your soul is concerned, then into your innermost, you should not allow just whoever it may be. Question. And one more thing. Like our reconnaissance agents, after all, they also lie, pretending to be others in the countries where they work. You see, intelligence is a branch of activity in a crowd elite society. One way or the other, it is connected with some unpreviousness and conflicts within the crowd elite society of humanity. In general, they occur within allowance. Therefore, when you or someone else entering into the activities of the armed forces and special services, you must understand that one way or the other, you will violate some ethical standards. Well, in particular, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," it is predeterminedly programmed at once. Its violation occurs as soon as you join any military forces. And the only question is, for the sake of what are you going to violate it? The same applies to all other commandments. Do not lie and everything else. But at the same time, it must be understood that in any case you are acting within the boundaries of allowance by strength of the fact that the crowd elite culture of subhumanity is what it is. Question. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, intellect is understood as a self-changing, self-tuning algorithm of selection, transformation of information, as a result of the activity of which there appear informational modules, previously unknown to a given subject, and which did not enter into it from the outside in a ready-to-use form. A model with a roulette and lottery drum is also described to clarify this concept. To me, as a non-mathematician, this definition and explanation based on the model is completely incomprehensible. I understand the definition and explanation given by Viktor Alexeyevich Yefimov in a lecture about God. Intellect is the ability to receive some information from the outside and, under its impact, change one's own parameters. Intellect in the universe is hierarchical, and there are discrete levels that do not communicate with each other: plants, animals, man, God. And, as I now understand, the noosphere, the universe, and likely many other intellects between man and God, of which I have no idea yet. From the level of the intellect of the plant, the animal is uncognizable, just as God is uncognizable for man by intellect. Is it possible to rely on this definition by V.A. Yefimov? You see, after all, the intellect produces the information that did not exist before. Yes, information can be obtained in a ready-to-use form from the outside, but this will not be an intellectual activity. Further, intellect as a process. If there is a process, informational algorithmic process in the given case, then there must always be some kind of material carrier. And further, the question arises about the frequency characteristics of the processes that can occur in this material carrier, and the amount of matter that is minimally necessary in order to be able to carry the intellect as a process. The question about the organization of this matter. Therefore, what from our point of view is not a carrier of intellect, in reality, it may be a fragment of some material structure that actually carries intellect. In order for our intellect to interact with it, communication is required. That is, compatibility of two intellects in energy. That is, on the basis of what processes they interact, exchange information, and the compatibility of both intellects in information coding systems. If any of these conditions are not present, then the interaction of intellects is impossible. Well, if there is no interaction of intellects, then in reality we can perceive as intellectless those objects and processes that in actual fact carry a certain intellect, but not human intellect, another one that solves different tasks in creation. Question: when a man and a woman supplement each other working in tandem, does the man still have the role of the head of the family? If there is no head in such a family, but there are two equal partners or something else. Thank you for your hard work. And what do you understand under the head of the family? Someone who is responsible for revealing the situation and giving all family members guidelines that they should all follow, or something else. The psyche of men and women is really different. It has been known for a long time that the psyche of men works mainly in a single tasking mode. The psyche of a woman works easily and simply in a multitasking mode. From here come anecdotes about female logic, when a man is not able to make out the flows of information related to different tasks that a woman solves simultaneously. In addition to everything, nervous activity is the basis of psychic activity. It is conditioned by the physiology of the organism. One of the regulators of the organism's physiology is our hormonal system. And a man's hormonal background is more or less stable over long periods of time. The only thing that there can be is fatigue, exhaustion of the organism. Yes, they change the hormonal background. A woman's hormonal background changes throughout the month in accordance with the cycle. Therefore, on some days a woman can be super brilliant, and on other days the same woman can barely cope with the governance towards some simple household or other things on the basis of developed automatisms. In the family, all this should be taken into account in some way. But after all, the dynamic distribution of responsibilities should be a normal thing, so that there is more time for communication with each other. Well, for communication with children, since the main function of the family is the continuation of the ancestral line, not just reproduction of the biomass of the species Homo sapiens, but upbringing of children as humans. And this also requires the mutual attention of the older relatives and, above all, parents, both to each other and to children. Therefore, the term, "what is the head of the family?" Well, in general, depending on how you answer it, you will get a certain result. On the other hand, for the dynamic distribution of responsibilities in the family, both spouses should be ready. Because if someone is ready and the other is not ready, then the processes fall apart. Because the second, waiting for instructions, showing non-initiativeness, or showing inappropriate initiative in inappropriate conditions, is able to break the family up. Question: autosynchronization in human society at the first worldview priority raises the question. From the examples you gave, it is clear that autosynchronization is connected with the spread of certain stereotypes, systems of stereotypes, behavior, or thinking in society. But how can one implement the phenomenon of autosynchronization in the processes of cognition and creativity? Creativity is not formalizable art, which means that it will not be possible to express them through a finite number of stereotypes templates. It is not about the fact that autosynchronization is on the first priority. On the methodological, cognitive, nosological priority. This is a certain set of stereotypes, templates, skills. But if the personal culture, cognitive creative culture, is widespread enough in society, if there are no claims to personal copyright, but there is a desire to create something good, to cognize a certain truth, then if someone alone starts a process, and the theme of this creativity, cognition, is interesting to others, then they can be engaged in it, possessing a cognitive creative culture. If there is no cognitive creative culture, then they can only be fans, evaluators, but incompetent evaluators. Therefore, the question of autosynchronization on the worldview priority is not a question of certain templates and skills. This is the question of the dissemination of precisely cognitive creative culture, the art of dialectics, other creative arts. Well, and further it turns out
Ну а дальше
that either
получается,
the
как
tandem principle works
работает либо
or the
тандемный
polytandem
принцип,
principle
либо
works.
политандемный
But if
принцип.
polytandem
Если
activity
начинается
begins,
политандемная деятельность, то это уже
then this is
считается
already
модулем
considered the mode of
автосинхронизации.
autosynchronization.
Другое дело, насколько
Another thing is how
распространена
widespread
культура
and effective cognitive creative culture is in society,
и
and who will be engaged in this
кто
process.
втянется в этот процесс. Ну а дальше
Well, then it
понимаете,
turns out that if
получается
someone
так,
does
что
not possess it,
если кто-то
then
не
coming into
владеет,
contact with the
то
creativity of others,
творчеством других, не с
not with the
плодами
fruits of
творчества, а с
creativity, but with the process of creativity,
процесс
the
творчества
process of
всегда
creativity
требует
always
определенного
requires a certain
состояния.
mood.
То человек,
Then a person,
оказавшись
finding
в
himself in a
творческой
creative
среде,
environment,
может
can read this
считать
mood
это
and then
настроение
reproduce
и
it in
дальше
himself.
воспроизводить в себе. Это будет
This will be a
стартом к
start
тому,
to ensure
чтобы
that
он
he
сам
himself is engaged
занялся
in cognitive creative
познавательно-творческой
activity.
деятельностью. И если
And if,
начав
having
ее,
started it,
он все-таки
he,
развил
after
в
all,
себе
develops in himself
достаточно
a sufficiently effective cognitive creative culture,
то все будет
then
хорошо.
everything will be fine.
Потому что, еще
Because once
раз,
again, you see,
понимаете,
the main
главные
secrets of the
тайны
life of every person,
жизни
of
каждого
human
человека,
societies,
человеческих обществ, они
they are
связаны
connected with the
с тайной
secret of
создания
creating a mood
настроения,
that ensures the
которое
effectiveness of the chosen activity.
обеспечивает эффективность избранной деятельности. Если
If
вы
you
не в
are unable to
состоянии
create a
создать
mood,
настроение,
then the
то
result will be
результат будет
negative,
отрицательным.
and you will not get away
Никуда
from
вы от
this.
этого не денетесь. А если вы в
And if you are
состоянии
able to create a
создать
mood,
настроение, то, в общем,
then
творчество, как
creativity
искусство,
is like the art of sailing. You are present in the process, but the process goes by itself and somehow carries you, although you certainly govern it. Well, that's it with the questions. Now let's go further into processes in supersystems.
Дальше к процессам в суперсистемах.
Section 13.4
13.4.
Sobornal Intellect in
Соборный интеллект в
Supersystems.
суперсистемах. Ну, определение соборного
The definition of Sobornal Intellect, this term appeared in 1991.
В первом году и появился как
and
результат
appeared as a
желания
result
уйти
of the wish to get away from foreign words.
Ну, потом все-таки
Then it became clear that this is not an entirely accurate definition, and it would be more correct to talk about the collective intellect in supersystems.
Почему? Ну, по той простой
Why?
причине, что потом стало
Well, for
понятно,
the
что
simple reason that
соборность это
later it became
специфическая
clear that subordinate
коллективная
is a
психика,
specific collective
которая
psyche
характеризует
which is characterized by the fact that there are no internal conflicts in it.
в ней все протекает
In it,
таким образом,
everything
что
flows in such a
любое
way
действие
that
одного
any action of one
индивида
individual
поддерживает
is supported by the
действия
actions of all others,
и в свою
and,
очередь,
in turn,
оказывает
supports the
поддержку
activities of some other
деятельности
individuals.
каких-то других индивидов. И, соответственно, нету конфликтов
And,
управления
accordingly,
частных.
there are no conflicts of particular governance, and all particular governances mutually supplement each other, and as a result, there arises a certain new quality,
Не обеспечивает
which is not ensured in the presence of internal conflicts in the supersystem for any reason.
системе по любому поводу. Поэтому термин
Therefore, the term
«соборный
Sobornal
интеллект»
Intellect, in the general case, was introduced erroneously.
был введен ошибочно, но
but in relation to the context of the sufficiently general theory of governance. A thinking person should understand the difference when it comes to collective intellect, in which internal conflicts are possible, that is a kind of collective schizophrenia, and when it comes to the truly sobornal intellect, in which all internal conflicts have not only been eliminated, but also the prerequisites for their occurrence have been eliminated. I bypassed the theme of intellect as such in these lectures because the model of intellect that was originally presented in Deadwater in the sufficiently general theory of governance, its task was simple, to show that we can perceive as intellect a certain process that is not inherently intellectual, but the process appears as an intellectual process only thanks to the fact that there is the concept of the triunity of matter, information, and measure, and thanks to this, the principle, as is the question, so is the answer, works. The principle of supplementarity of information, which is conditioned precisely by measure, also works. The principle of supplementarity of information on the example of the Pythagorean theorem. Now, if you hear the words Pythagorean theorem and can remember a little mathematics, then you should understand that this means, at the same time, both the classical formulation, the sum of the squares on the legs of a right triangle is equal to the square on the hypotenuse, and a whole series of concomitant circumstances, that if we multiply the legs, then we get the doubled area of the triangle. The hypotenuse is the diameter of the circle that is around this triangle, and much more. But the fact that the principle of supplementarity of information works, this is conditioned by measure, that matrix of possible states of matter, which, in relation to information, is the information coding system. And intellect is also connected with measure and is its expression. Therefore, this model of the intellect, which was presented as a kind of game, it is simply one of the illustrations on the theme that intellect is impossible without measure. What else to say? We have been told that some people have built a game like this and really convinced themselves on the fact that the game is functionally operable. Of course, the game is primitive. This is in no way artificial intelligence, not a self-learning system, not a system that cognizes the world. But these are different things, because the thematics of artificial intelligence is one of the directions of engineering activity that requires deep and extensive knowledge. And if this theme is set out in such a book as Deadwater, or the Sufficiently General Theory of Governance, then without special knowledge, many will not be able to understand this. Therefore, one should not pay special attention to it and raise this example to the rank of a certain absolute. This is simply an example, an illustration of the fact that intellect should be perceived as a pan-natural process. And as academician N.M. Amosov wrote, the
the
laws by which the intellect functions are the same for the human intellect and for the collective intellect of society and for artificial intellect. We just need to try to understand these laws and be able to use them, including in order to eliminate glitches in the work of our own intellect and help other people also eliminate these glitches. But, on the other hand, one must understand that the same knowledge can be used to destroy someone else's intellectual activity in various political technologies with the objective of creating certain dependencies and social organizational systems which, by and large, should not exist in human society because they violate the principles of ethics. But if the weak innate morality of the herd-pack monkey of the species Homo sapiens operates, then the abuse of all knowledge, including knowledge about intellect, both in the field of artificial intellect and in the field of impacting human intellect, is inevitable. Where does this lead? Back in 1954, Stanislav Lem, in the Star Diaries of Yon Tichy, wrote, "See, Journey to the Planet of the Idiots. There, on the planet, all life is subordinated to artificial intelligence. And the artificial intelligence quite rightly decides that the main problem of the planet is the idiots who bring disorder and prevent the creation of an ideal order, and the artificial intelligence begins to destroy the idiots." Nevertheless, if we recognize that every one of us has this or that intellect, this or that intellectual power, then the question of collective intellect arises. Because if we exchange information with each other, then we must understand that the process of information exchange generates a collective intellect. And collective intellect really works. But if we talk about how it works, then this has not so much to do with the sufficiently general theory of governance as with the practice of our life. It really works if we generate it and know how to use it. How were Dead Water and other works written? It all started back in the pre-computer era. What happened in those days? In those days there was paper and all sorts of pens. How did we work? A4 format size notebook, 96 sheets. Well, what it's now customary in the social networks to call Team Starter, took a pen and wrote some initial text. On the right side of the sheet, leaving the left side of the notebook blank and free, wrote with an ink pen, because the ink pen has the advantage that the ink runs out of the pen itself, and the text is obtained without much physical effort. Well, in other lectures dedicated to calligraphy, I said that as soon as we inhibit these or those muscle groups, as soon as we have some kind of static muscle tension, then some part of our psyche is immediately turned off, that part which is enclosed on providing this static tension. Therefore, writing the original text with an ink pen was physiologically consistent with the task of maximizing the existing culture of the intellectual activity of the individual. It is clear that the original text, in the form in which it arose as a result of such a process, needed refinement. In order to refine, there was another pen, also an ink one, which made it possible to write in every square of the sheet, clearly, to make supplements with fine writing. Other minor supplements could be made with a multicolored ballpoint pen. If, while reading the text, there appeared a need to add something else, then the left side of the notebook made it possible to write there what else was needed. And in such a form, the original text was read by all the participants of the project, and each of them had the right to delete from it anything that he found necessary, correct anything in it that he found necessary, and supplement it with what he found necessary. And in this way, the notebook with the original text, being filled with supplements, circulated among the project participants, who, having a certain cognitive creative culture, possessing dialectics as the art of posing a question and finding an answer to it at some level, could enter into this process. In a number of cases, after the original text grew with edits and supplements, it was necessary to rewrite everything, taking into account these edits and supplements, so that a person who had nothing to do with the process itself could understand this mass. In a number of cases, sticky additions, insertions were added to the original text, and the original text actually looked, purely outwardly, like a disheveled head of cabbage. In the end, a text arose that suited all the participants in the process. Who was the author of this text? Personally, no one. Because the text was formed in a certain way, precisely as a result of collective activity, and the text represented itself well, in the essence of things, as a stream of thoughts, a stream of images, encoded in the lexicon and grammar of the Russian language. By what else was this text characterized? By the fact that at least several years passed, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, before the creators of the text could each single-handedly say that something in the text was wrong, that something had to be written a little differently, and in fact it would be good to touch upon this theme here, and this is presented somewhat in the wrong way, and in one way or the other, either it's incomplete or erroneous.
Здесь вот важно обратить внимание на то, что
Here it is important to pay attention to the fact that the text that was criticized by someone after several years, it appeared several years earlier than it was criticized, and it expressed in itself the result of collective intellectual activity. That is, it was an expression of a certain collective intellect. And up to the level of this collective intellect, the participants in this collective intellect had to develop over the course of several years in order to say that here something is wrong, here something is either erroneous or not as detailed as is required in practice. Therefore, the materials of the conception of social safety are proof that collective intellect is really not a fiction, but a really existing phenomenon. And we must learn to build collective intellect and collective psyche, and build it in such a way that there does not emerge collective schizophrenia, in the conditions of which the crowd elite humanity has been living for many centuries. In section 13.4, the television show What, Where, When is recalled. In my understanding, this is a profanation of what is called collective intellect. A kind of discrediting and blocking the paths on which the skill of building collective intellects is acquired. Why? You see, in life there are many things that cannot be reproduced in laboratory testing ground conditions. Such things require real problems in relation to intellectual activity and real solutions to these problems. Connoisseurs in that game do not deal with real problems. They are engaged in some kind of nonsense. Because if you ask them to simply analyze the situation in the country, generators of problems that operate in our society, generators of problems that operate in the global civilization, then the show What, Where, When will immediately collapse. Because collective intellectual activity does not presuppose personal copyright for the result. That is, it does not presuppose either Crystal Owls Awards or Masters of the Game Awards or anything like that. It presupposes either the obtaining of the result without personal copyright, or the absence of a result as an analysis of serious, real problems that interfere with the life of society. But there exist Masters, Crystal Owl Awards, musical commercials, different shows, and so on and so forth. On a larger scale, approximately the same thing is carried out by our Academy of Sciences, as well as any other Academy of Sciences.
Это как раз система персональных авторских
And one of the factors hindering the development of science, and one of the factors in generating all sorts of pseudosciences, this is precisely the system of personal copyright, which is the destroyer of the processes of assembling collective intellects. And the absence of collective intellect, in a number of cases, generates what the Higher Attestation Commission calls the crisis of fragmentation of social science. Well, not only of social science, but also the crisis of fragmentation of all sciences in general, and scientific knowledge as a whole, when narrow specialists are not able to understand each other and not able to organically supplement each other in the solution of various kinds of complex tasks and the execution of complex projects that require an interdisciplinary dialogue. This is really one of the big problems of our time and the development of science as such in general. Further arises the question about the generation of collective intellect without schizophrenia, that is, Sobornist, in which everything is harmonious, organically mutually supplementary, conflict-free, without disorders, everything is phased and timely. If we turn to the problem of intellect in general, not only human intellect, then there is something that in human society is called nraviousness. Nraviousness, functionally, is an analog of conditional jump operators in algorithms of information processing. And if a certain condition is met, then some actions. If conditions are not met, then other actions. So the building of Sobornist requires a certain nraviousness. The type of nraviousness that in the Russian language is called pravednost, praviousness. Praviousness, this is nraviousness expressing the laws of development, those 6 groups of objective laws to which the life of human society and every person individually is subordinated. If the nraviousness of individuals is compatible with each other, then the building of collective intellect by them goes without any particular problems. If their nraviousness is not compatible, then it's inevitable that the processing of the same initial information in one intellect will lead to one result, in another intellect to different results. And the interconnection of these intellects, of building a collective integral intellect, for these individuals turns out to be impossible. What can one do in such a situation? Well, what to do in such situations is explained in the materials of the conception, dead water, the preliminary materials of the training course, the sufficiently general theory of governance, dialectics and atheism, and in foundations of sociology.
Если по одному и
This
тому
is
же
what is
факту
called the
два
tandem principle.
взаимоисключающих или как-то иначе несовместимых друг с другом мнения, то
If there are two
надо
mutually
попытаться
exclusive
досудить
or
те
otherwise
причины,
not compatible
почему
opinions
эти мнения
on one and the
расходятся.
same question,
Причины могут быть разными.
then
Первое,
it's
разная
necessary to get to the
информированность
bottom of the
для
subjective
объединения
reasons
баз
as to
данных
why these opinions differ.
фактологии позволяет
The reasons may be different.
согласовать оба мнения. Могут быть
First,
нравственные
different
различия.
informedness,
До них
then
можно
the unification of
докопаться
databases,
и понять,
factology,
какой из
enables the
нарративов стандартный
reconciliation of both
ближе к
opinions.
объективным закономерностям развития. И,
There may be
соответственно,
inobvious
кто
differences.
ближе, тот и прав, а тот
You can
и
also
виноват.
get to the bottom of
Дальше
them
тот
and
каким
understand
образом
which of the
порождает
inobvious standards is closer to the objective laws of
И,
development, and
соответственно,
accordingly,
если
the one that is
заниматься
closer
такого
is
рода
right.
анализом, то тогда получается тандемный
And the
режим
one that is further,
деятельности,
in some way,
первичный
generates a defective opinion.
коллективный интеллект,
And
он
accordingly,
хорошо отвал
if you engage in this kind of analysis,
тем не менее,
then you get a
и дальше
tandem mode of
можно
activity.
спорить. Коллективный
This is the
интеллект
primary
тоже
collective intellect.
обладает
Two minds are better than one.
более чем двумя исходными базовыми интеллектами.
But,
Его
nevertheless,
действительно
it is
будет
possible to build a collective intellect
мощь
further,
коллективного
which has
интеллекта
more than two
превышает
initial basic
пропорционально
intellects,
количеству участников. Но при
and its
условии,
power will
что
indeed be higher.
участники нравственно
Moreover, the
совместимы
power of the
друг с
collective
другом
intellect
и
grows
обладают
superproportionally in relation to the number of participants, but on the condition that the participants are unobviously compatible with each other and possess a certain dialectical culture of cognition, which enables them to pose questions commensurably to the measure of being, and from the same measure of being, to extract answers to these questions, resolving non-determinations.
Вот. Дальше все-таки надо
Further,
понимать
you need
то,
to
что
understand that
интеллект
any intellect
любой
always solves the
всегда
task of
решает
governance.
задачи управления. Это же касается и
The same
коллективного
applies to collective intellects,
который
which also carry
несет
either the entire function of
либо
governance
полную функцию
or some
управления,
fragments of a
либо
certain entire function of governance
некой полной
or
функции
several entire
управления,
functions of
несколько
governance.
полных функций управления. Ну, сами понимаете, что термин
You
полная
see,
функция
the term entire
управления
function of governance is abstractionism, and collective intellectual activity is always concretics.
это всегда конкретика.
That is, these are also certain concrete entire functions of governance.
Полные функции управления. Здесь, в общем-то, важно то, что коллективный
It is
интеллект
important here
может
that collective intellect
существовать
can
на
exist on a renewing element base.
обновляющейся базе. То есть люди могут
That
уходить
is,
и приходить
people
в
can
жизнь,
leave and come into life,
коллективный
and
интеллект
the
будет
collective
существовать.
intellect will exist.
И вступая в жизнь, люди будут включаться
And
в этот
entering into
коллективный
life,
интеллект,
people will be
принимать в себя
included in this
какие-то
collective intellect.
процессы, которые в нем
They will take into
протекают,
themselves some processes that flow in it,
развивать эти процессы и завершая
develop these
свою
processes,
жизнь, передавать
and,
эти
coming to
процессы
the end of their lives,
либо
they
непосредственно
will
в
transition
личном
these
общении,
processes
либо
either
опосредованно
directly in
через
personal
ноосферу
communication
другим людям,
or
которые
indirectly
будут
through the
воспринимать
noosphere
продолжатели
to other
его
people who will be the receivers and successors of their work.
В этом отношении интересно рассмотреть
In this
тему
regard, it's interesting to consider the
взаимоотношений
theme of the
Александра
relationship
Сергеевича
between
Пушкина.
Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin and Nikolai I. You see, Nikolai I is a figure who, in our history, has been slandered by historians, primarily of the liberal wing. He was certainly not an angel in the flesh. Many human weaknesses were inherent in him. But he was not a tyrant soldier, the way he is presented by liberal historians. When Pushkin was summoned by him from exile, and they talked face to face in Moscow, then, to all appearances, Pushkin revealed to him a lot of things that the Tsar was not able to accept and meaningfully comprehend, but was also unable to refute. And the fact that he turned out to be not able to build a tandem relationship with Alexander Sergeyevich had a negative impact on both his reign and on the fate of Russia. But the question arises, did this communication happen without a trace? It seems that it should have gone without a trace. Pushkin died in 1837. Nikolai I, contrary to the opinion replicated by historians, was killed in 1855. And then they began to cultivate the version of his suicide. Many people believe this version, although it is really not psychologically reliable. Even with the fact that the Bible and the traditions of the Orthodox Church distorted his religiosity, one must nonetheless understand that this person consciously comprehended two things. The first is that suicide is a sin, and second, that he, as a Tsar, is responsible before God for Russia. And accordingly, had he committed suicide, he would have committed a double sin. The first sin is suicide as a sin, and the second sin is the throwing off of the assigned to him and shouldered by him responsibility for Russia. Therefore, the version about the suicide of Nikolai I is not reliable. This is a false version. He was killed because the coalition of European powers was a little tired of the war, and the Treaty of Paris that took place in history, it would not have existed if Nikolai I had continued to lead the state. Well, so both were gone. But what further? And further, you should see the memoirs of the Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, the grandson of Nikolai I. Yes, he did not become the all-Russian emperor, but nonetheless his memoirs say that there was something that Pushkin told Nikolai I, and which Nikolai I could not perceive and realize in his reign and his governing time. That is, you see, the noosphere really exists, because otherwise, in the notes of the Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, that which found expression in them would not have found expression in them,
и то,
and that which unites him and Pushkin,
и Пушкина.
and unites all of us in a noospheric, intellectual process of working out the meaning of life for humanity in general and Russia in particular. This brings us to the beginning of section 13.5. I think that's enough for today. Thank you for your attention. A lot of information has been said today. It needs meaningful comprehension and recomprehension, in which I wish you success. Until the next time.